level of speed because most of part are overlapped with your previous lecture notes. So I will bravely skip some part of that to boost up the speed, and we will focus on more some regional issue of that kinds of like this chapter. So most of the pages of my lecture note is focused on specific region of the Asian economy, especially the Caucasus and the Central Asian region. To be honest, before making this lecture note, I didn't figure out what's the difference between Caucasus and Central Asia. Do you guys know exact difference between those two regions?
Caucasian and Central Asia? I don't know, I feel like
Caucasians
Caucasians are white people.
like Georgia?
Yes, yes. Georgia is part of the Caucasus region, like Armenia or Azerbaijan, or the southern western part of Russia is also called the Caucasus region.
Caucasus Mountain. I guess.
I don't know.
Caucasus Mountain.
Okay. And the Central Asia includes some Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or Kyrgyz Republic. Or the kinds of countries are included in Central Asia. So to be honest, I didn't know what's the difference between the Caucasus and the Central Asia, but now I can figure out. Okay, so Caucasus is more like Eastern European region and really western part of Asia, like Azerbaijan or Georgia. And the Central Asia includes some part of the Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, or Turkmenistan. The kinds of countries are called the Central Asian countries. But anyway, the economic effect of Russian war on those two regions are pretty much common because it's really similar situation economically. So, and the economic effect of that Russian war was actually really positive on this region. It's really different from the other regions like the East Asian countries or some advanced economies like the United States or the European Union. They had a lot of negative effect from the Russian-Ukraine war, but this Caucasus and Central Asia, like this, exceeded expectations in 2022 because of that war. So what kinds of the party effect from this Russian war we can see in detail in the next lines. So this growth, so kinds of unexpected growth from the Russian war on this region is fueled by the increased Russian consumption and the business activity which lead to a significant rise in the remittances. So because of this war, Russia needed additional support from the neighborhood countries, and they need more money to spend their national defense or making a lot of the kinds of army services. And there have been a lot of the newly created trade between the Russia and the other neighborhood countries. So export to Russia from this region, the Caucasus or Central Asia, has been really surged, which means that there was a lot of consumption demand from Russian side because of this war. And also the re-export constituting 49% of the increase, which means that some Russian companies moved their location from Russia to these neighborhood countries because they needed to avoid the negative effect of the war. If you are still locating in Russia, then the Russian government will need you to support them by maybe transforming your factory to some factories for the army production or something. It is really happening in many even advanced countries like South Korea. If you go to some northern part of South Korea, you can easily see a road here. And there is some small tunnel like this in the big road. You can easily see these kinds of really weird creature in usual South Korean road. And this kinds of creature was built by the army service. In the case of the war happen, then the northern part, like the North Korean army will definitely invade into the South Korean territory. Then South Korean army will destroy this one, so they will easily block the road. So the tanks or the other North Korean army cannot proceed into some southern part of South Korea. So most of buildings or most of the road or the other infrastructure designed or architecture by South Korean government is designed for the potential war. Because, as you guys are really familiar with the kind of fact, the Korean War is not ended yet. It is a really ongoing war. So we are still under the war between the North and South Korean territory. So most of the infrastructure or most of the factory design in South Korea are designed for the potential support for war against the North Korea or the other potential armies enemies like Japan or China. The same, Russian companies are definitely required to dedicate to the Russian-Ukraine war during the war is happening. So they think that it is not profitable for their company's revenue or the long-term plan. So they avoid the kinds of required action by moving their HQ or headquarters to the neighborhood countries because language barrier is pretty low and their geographical distance is pretty close each other, so they can still continue their own business activity even if they move out of the Russia, and they can do that. So these kinds of export and the re-export between Russia and the neighborhood countries are the main factor in the boosting up their economy in the last year. So the GDP growth for overall developing Asia was estimated by 4.8% for both 2023 and 2024. And the inflation rate is 4.2% in estimation in 2023, and it will be much lower down in 2024. So in recently, the KDI, one of the Korean think tank, estimated Korea's GDP growth rate at 2.2% in 2024, and the inflation rate will be 3.5% in my memory in 2024. So compared with the overall developing Asia's estimation of GDP growth rate, which is 4.8%, it is way higher than the Korea's expected GDP growth in next year. So Korea is not the developing countries anymore in terms of the growth rate or inflation rate. If there is more economic activity between economic agents in your country, definitely there will be more need for trading cash or some money-based asset. So inflation is a natural outcome of the more economic activity. So higher growth rate, the higher inflation rate is a natural thing. They are pairing together. So 4.8% for developing Asia's GDP and 4.2% in 2023 and 3.3% in 2024 for inflation for those regions are pretty much natural to think they synchronize each other. But in Korea's case, from the perspective of the KDI, their GDP expectation for next year much lower than 4.8, and their inflation is still a little bit high. So we can easily conclude that Korea will be a little bit more difficult situation than the rest of the regions in Asian countries. So the keyword for the Asian economy, especially for developing part of the Asian economy, is the recovery or the reopening. So it is heavily affected by the two biggest countries in the world. One part is China and the other part is Russia. So 2022 was the slowing down period for the Asian countries. And this kinds of slowdown in 2022 was mainly caused by the China's zero COVID policy. With the zero COVID policy, it was very hard to get into the Chinese territory if we are foreigner. Even if you are the Chinese, it was very hard to get into the Chinese territory. You have to quarantine yourself for 2 weeks, and you should prove that you are enough healthy after the 2 weeks of quarantine, and your economic activity would be strictly restricted by the Chinese government or the kind of police or something. And there are another kind of additional restrictions or some regulations on you if you get out of your country. So Chinese zero COVID policy strictly regulated the mobility of the labor, the kind of potential labor of China and also some neighborhood countries. That was strictly negative impact on the most of the Asian countries region. So the East Asian case, their growth rate was just only 2.8 last year, down from the 7.9% in the last year, so 2021. So that was the huge drop between 7.8, almost 8% of growth rate in 2021, but they had only 2.8% last year. But the Pacific and the Southeast Asian regions experienced a kind of strengthening of growth last year because of their China's zero COVID strategy was lifted up in the middle of 2022. So because of that kind of reopening of China's economy, neighborhood countries, especially if they have some strength in tourism industry, they got the most benefit from the reopening policy of China. So the second half of 2022 was a little bit different from the first half because China decided to reopen their own economy to the rest of the Asian countries. So the Southeast Asian economy, they got a little bit boosted up because of this kinds of changing policy of China. So it has been dramatically kinds of contrast between a country's one group and the other group. One group has some strength in tourism. The other group, the more advanced economy, they have a lot of strength in the manufacturing industry, like South Korea, Singapore, or maybe Taiwan. These countries have been negatively impacted by Chinese reopening policy. Why? Before that, there is high demand for the durable good because you cannot move. You cannot get out of your house because of restriction. If you're Chinese guys, then it was strictly extremely hard to get out of your house. You could definitely have been seeing some YouTube video of some or the video clips of the China situation during this zero COVID policy. The Chinese police is pretty much severe for their civilian, right? And they just captured or they just arrested one or two Chinese people who really wanted to get out of their house, and they really tried to do that. Then they were just arrested by the police because they violated just zero COVID rule. So these kinds of extremely hard possibility to move out your house, which means that you can consume more dairy good and you cannot consume any kind of service good. So this is good news for South Korea because South Korea was one of the main countries who can produce semiconductor or cars or maybe ship or TV or displays. So the export of South Korea to China was boosted by this zero COVID policy. But after China decided to lift up the zero COVID policy, so they decided to reopen their economy, there is higher demand for the service industry. And one of the main kinds of representative types of service good is the tourism. You can travel out of your country and to go to the other country. That's one part of the service import, right? So with this reopening policy by China, South Korea, Singapore, or Taipei, or the other advanced economy in East Asia who produced a lot of durable goods was negatively impacted. But the other countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, these countries are pretty much famous for their own tourism economy or tourism industry, right? Malaysia is pretty famous for that kinds of travel or tourism. So what? Kota Kinabalu is in Malaysia? I never know about that.
It's like an island. It's like Jeju Island in Indonesia.
So is there a direct flight from Incheon to Kota Kinabalu?
As far as I know, there is a flight. As far as I know.
There was a flight.
Yeah, I
Direct flight.
went on a direct flight. First one. Yeah, from
I want to return to. Yeah, that is fine.
Okay, so the Malaysia is pretty famous for tourism, according to him. And Thailand is definitely famous for tourism, and Indonesia has the kinds of really good places.
Indonesia.
Mali?
Like Indonesia.
In Mali, yeah. So yeah, and Philippines maybe. So these kinds of Southeast Asian countries have a specific place for the travelers spot. So they have positively been affected by the reopening policy of the China. So dramatically, contrasted between some countries and the other countries because of China's changing policy here. So this is growth rate. I think the GDP growth rate on the left side picture is the growth rate in 2022 and 2021. So most of countries in, so this is developing Asia, and this is developing Asia except China, and this is Caucasus, and this is East Asia. So East Asia has their GDP dropped mostly from about 8% to about 3%. But these Southeast Asian countries have some reverse growth rate from 3.5 to more than 5%. So they have received some benefit from changing policy of China. And this Pacific area, they actually have negative growth rate in 2021, but they had a huge improvement in their GDP growth rate in 2022. So Southeast Asian region and the Pacific region of Asia, they got the most beneficiary countries. And East Asian countries, including South Korea, Singapore, or Japan, maybe Taiwan, Hong Kong, these type of countries have negatively impacted by China's reopening policy. You can conclude that. And Caucasus and Central Asian countries, they drop a little bit, but their GDP growth rate decrease is not so significant. So we can have some mixed effect from Russia and China. So the same picture on the right side, the output losses is pretty hard in East Asian economy. They lost a lot of output losses from 2021 to 2022. But in the Pacific area and the Southeast Asian countries, their output losses has been improved from negative 9% to negative 8.5% and from negative more than 12% to a little bit worse than the 10% here. So those two regions are pretty good with China's reopening policy, but the East Asian economy got pretty bad news from China. So the overall landscape of the developing Asia here. So with the reopen policy, we can easily observe that there is a shift in the demand side from durable good to a service good. So we bought enough number of cars, we bought enough number of televisions and audio system or refrigerator during the pandemic era. And as pandemic era ended up pretty soon in 2022 and the early period of 2023, we turned our interest to some service industry, so we can go to the restaurant, we can go to coffee shop, we can go to the theater to watch some movies. So this service industry area is the most improved area in 2023 and will be also in 2024. So Southeast Asian economy has some strengths in inviting more people from China or the other regions because of their strengths in their tourism economy. So the reopening was a huge factor to contribute economic improvement for this region. So we can have the really easing the border restrictions. So we can have some increase in tourism or number of tourists into the kinds of region. But the bad news is also happening to some other countries like semiconductor cycle present a little bit of challenges recently. So South Korea, Taiwan, or Singapore, their business cycles related to the semiconductor cycles have been negatively impacted in 2022. But the good news was recently released by many newspapers that this semiconductor cycle will be now up cycle pretty soon in the end of this year. So it will be a little bit good news for Samsung or the SK Hynix Electronics. They will face a pretty good time in 24, the early period of 2024, because the semiconductor cycles will be, now they got some bottom part of that, so they will go to some peak part pretty soon in 2024. Okay, so this picture is the growth component in the developing Asia. So we can decompose the main contributors to the GDP growth for each country. For instance, in India, the private consumption was the biggest part of contributions to their economic growth rate in 2021, maybe, and in 2022 as well. How about Korea? Yeah, Korea is here. So they got negative net export, which means that they imported more than their exported goods or services. So the net export was negative in the GDP of South Korea last year. So they got the negative impact on their GDP growth rate. So South Korea was very struggling in exporting their good, and their exporting good was mostly their good, rather than the services. They have really huge negative net export in service, and they got pretty small amount of positive net export in good, the manufactured good. Because South Korean guys really love to go out of their country and enjoy some cultures abroad. And South Korea does not have enough number of attractive things for the tourists from the outside the country. So their net exports in service industry has been always negative here. And this negative part of their net export was pretty huge and never overcame by the positive net export in the very good export. So South Korea had some part of problem in their international trade in the last year. And maybe what kind of the other industry would be interesting? Okay, so how about China? China's private consumption has been consistent from last year, but their main contributor to the GDP growth rate was investment rather than the consumption, according to this graph. This investment is mostly invested in some housing or the building industry, some construction industry. But we heard that in the last lecture note, that their housing market has been busted. So their economy will face pretty much negative period of time in early time of 2024 because their housing market will going down further. So there will be a little bit of financial tightening in the Chinese financial market. It means that it's getting harder to borrow some money and interest rate will go up, even the inflation rate is going down. So a little bit hard time will be estimated for China, according to this graph. But some Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia, Philippines, or Thailand, their GDP growth rate was pretty higher than rest of the world, rest of the Asian countries, and their main contributors was private consumption in Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand. And their net export was also positive here in Thailand and in Malaysia. It turned from negative to the positive one. And their negative net export for Philippines has been decreased a lot. So their export or international trade status has been pretty getting better in the last year because of China's new reopening policy. So our conclusion is that South Asian countries will be benefited from China's reopening policy in terms of GDP growth rate or in terms of the net export from negative to positive. But some countries with more emphasis on the manufacturing good exporting, like South Korea, Taiwan, or China, or maybe Japan, they will have some difficult time because of the consumption, overall consumption will be shifted from the durable good to service good. So there will be less demand for more durable good, mainly helped by some semiconductor industry, but the tourism economy will be pretty much boom in the specific regions like Southeast or the Pacific area. So there's kind of things we can expect. So growth components in developing Asia. So overall GDP for developing Asia was 3.9%, and their agriculture industries contributions was pretty small, even in India or the China. Most of the good part is the service industry in India, China, or Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, which means that first degree industry or the second degree industry, like the manufacturing or factory or producing something, is not the main contributor to their GDP growth anymore. At least this year and maybe next year. The biggest part is service industry. Most of Southeast Asian countries like this, and even for India, Singapore, or Taipei. Definitely the question.
Can I ask what examples can be included in the service industry?
That's the question, and that's exactly what I was going to talk. We need to be a little bit careful about this velvet color line because the service industry in Singapore is really different from the service industry in Thailand. For instance, service industry in Singapore here, or maybe Hong Kong here, their main types of service is the financial service. So it is really advanced and high value added. But Thailand service and Indonesia service industry or the other part of Southeast Asian countries, these are usually the tourism industry. So industrial structure between one part of group and the other part of group is really different. Even they are both colored by the velvet, the service industry. So we need to differentiate, okay, so one part of the group of country in this region can be more dedicated to financial service industry. They are pretty much different from the tourism industry that is also defined by the service industry with the same color. So we need to figure out what's the difference between those two groups. One funny thing is that even if you go to the other country and spend some money, a part of your consumption will be defined by just private consumption, and the other part of your consumption will be defined by total export or import for a country. So, for instance, if you are here in Korea and maybe going to the Hong Kong, and there is Hong Kong restaurant here, and you pay some money. If you pay for your meal by cash, like Hong Kong dollar, it means that it is just private consumption inside the Hong Kong. It is not counted for any kind of international trade because you already changed your cash from Korean won to Hong Kong dollar, and you pay the money, and the restaurant cannot recognize your nationality by your payment method. If you pay the cash to the restaurant, then the restaurant owner will just receive the cash, and the cash doesn't have any nationality. It is just Hong Kong dollar. So it is private consumption. But if you pay the same amount of money in the credit card issued from Korea, it means it is service export in the point of view of Hong Kong. Because they sold these kinds of service, kinds of food or restaurant service to a foreigner. And this amount of payment by credit card will be paid by Korean card maker to specific bank in Hong Kong. And that specific bank of Hong Kong received the money or transmitted money from Korean bank or card brand, and they will pay this restaurant owner in the Hong Kong dollar cash. So the transition mechanism is really different if you pay cash or pay by the credit card. So if you pay your money in the cash, it is not counted any kind of international trade card. But if you pay in credit card, and the credit card issued from your own home country, then it will be counted by international trade. You will import some service from the country, and this restaurant will export some service to you or to your country. It is really complicated. The same economic activity, but a little bit differently defined. So the bottom line is that this picture will give you the brief kinds of big picture of the trend or economic kinds of changing kinds of trend or kinds of issue. So you can see the big picture with this picture, but you cannot believe this picture specifically. Maybe, wow, okay, so there is service is going up, so maybe service export will be pretty good for Singapore or Taiwan. Partly you will be right, but you can be a little bit more careful about specific detail of that. Because of, number definitely makes some jokes or sometimes lie to you. It will definitely make some illusion to your economic decision making. Okay, any other question? So far, so good. Right. So this is semiconductor sales and export in developing Asia's main technology exporters like South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. We don't have any Chinese guys in this classroom. So do you guys know why this graph does not write down Taiwan and they just prefer to write down Taipei rather than Taiwan? Because Taiwan is not officially a country in the perspective of Chinese guys. So, but we know that the Taiwan is independent country. They are independent from the mainland China. But if you have Chinese friends, you can ask them, is Taiwan a country or not? Then they definitely say that Taiwan is not a country. They are acting like a country, but we are not agree with the kinds of things of the argument. So that's the main reason why the official representative name of Taiwan is just Taipei, the name of city, and they put the China after that.
Why they don't accept this?
Yeah, there is long history between Taiwan and the mainland China. I'm not a historian, but if I use my maximum knowledge about the Chinese, the recent modern history, okay, so. Yeah, definitely we are going to Samsung for definitely for sure. So this is Korea, and this is mainland China. So after some political conflict between the China and the Western countries, the China finally tried to get independence from most of the imperial countries like Japan or United States or maybe France or the Germany. So they tried to make total independence from the kinds of westernized countries by doing some war. And inside China during that time or period, there are two main political powers. One part is Communist Party. And the other part is the more Democratic Party. So there were two types of, maybe two dimensions of the war. The first war is the war against the outside of enemy, against Japan, against Russia, against China, or against France or something. So the mainland China had to fight against United States or the other imperial countries. But the second dimension of the war was inside the Chinese territory. There were two main parties who will try to get some powers inside the Chinese territory. So one party is Communist Party and the other party is Democratic Party. And as a result of this second dimension of the war, the Communist Party won this game. So they dominated the entire territory of China. So these different kinds of defeated party, the Democratic Party, they had to run away from the Communist Party. And that's now the Taiwan here. So they moved out of the Chinese mainland. So there is a Taiwan is here. So after that, maybe that was 1950s or something. So maybe 70 years ago, the kind of things happened. I don't know exact number of that year. I was really bad when I was studying history. Then I was really bad in memorizing the year of something. This event happening in the year, I was really wrong. So as a result, now we can see the mainland China is totally controlled by this Communist Party, and it never changes. but they have also zero power in controlling the territory of this Taiwan or Taiwanese island, because within this land, within this island, the Democratic Party controlling all of this territory and the people here. So in fact, they are different countries, and because they pick up their own president by themselves, so political order is totally separate each other. The culture is different. Sometimes some languages are also different. In my best knowledge of that, they can definitely communicate each other, but they have different dictionary or something. So in my point of view, they are different country. But the problem was happened when in 1994, this mainly Chinese government decided to open their economy to the rest of the world. Before that, the Chinese economy was closed down. They are very closed economy, so they never traded their goods and services with the United States or the other westernized countries. But since 1994, Chinese government decided to, okay, so we are going to open our economy. We are very willing to trade any goods and services with even South Korea, which was one of the main ally to the United States. We can definitely open to communicate with you guys. So the Korea and the all other countries had to decide which one is the true China. Before that, Taiwan was the official China. So in the United Nations, Taiwan was the only member to the United Nations, because the United Nations did not approve China into the group of the United Nations. But after 1994, United Nations or the other countries had to decide, okay, main China is the real China, or the Taiwan is the main China. So their decision making was totally based on their economic profit or benefit. So for South Korean government, they decided to have the official relationship with the main China, which means that they had to cut down any kinds of relationship with the Taiwan. So there is no embassy of Taiwan in South Korean territory. You cannot find out the embassy of Taiwan in South Korea, because South Korea and Taiwan is not any kind of official relationship anymore. Because South Korea was going to the mainland China, which means that for Taiwan, we are now enemy each other. So every country has to decide, okay, I'm going to friend with this part or enemy of this part. So, and 99% of countries decided to go for the mainland China because they have bigger population, which means that bigger market. We can export more goods and services to the China rather than to Taiwan. So after that, Taiwan was kicked out of the United Nations because the Chinese, mainly China, was introduced to the United Nations. So as the Palestine, the same, Taiwan was not able to go for Olympic Games for several years because Taiwan was not an official country for some years, because China was approved as the main or the real or true China for the international part of the country. So that was really unfair to Taiwan, because Taiwan had been pretty good country for most of the countries, but because of the smaller population size, smaller market size, or less power in international dimension, they was just kicked out of the international kinds of political kinds of things. But now they recovered based on their economic power, like semiconductor production or the other kinds of cultural relationship with Japan or South Korea. They rebounded definitely, and now they can go for Olympic Games, and they have a little bit of voice power in the United Nations or the other international organization. But still, there is ongoing possibility of the war between the mainland China and Taiwan, because Chinese government just saw that Russia can definitely dominate Ukraine territory because of the kinds of war. So they saw some possibility, okay, they do that, so we can do that. So Chinese government are now preparing for some kinds of war. Because of this war, they can consume or they can just dominate Taiwan, because there are so many gaps between the main China and Taiwan in terms of the army power or something. So the only hope for Taiwan to survive more years is a power of the United States or the Japan, because Japan or the United States, maybe South Korea, are the biggest enemy for mainland China. So Taiwan is trying to make the good relationship with the United States or Japan or South Korea to survive themselves. So that's kind of story that, for my best knowledge, but I could be definitely wrong. But I'm really a little bit shameful of myself because my father was historian, and my father's major is Chinese history. And before retirement, he's retired right now, but before retirement, his latest interest was Taiwanese history. So he was really good at history about Taiwan, but I'm not good at that one, so it's pretty bad for me.
That's good. So they still have the argument between each other, right? There's two parties.
Yeah. So it is really clear in terms of mainland China because there is only one party, the Communist Party, and this power never changes. The President Xi Jinping is just ongoing powerful person. So their perspective on Taiwan never changes. The problem is here. Taiwan is more democratic country, so they can change their power. There are actually two extreme parties inside Taiwan. One party claims that Taiwan is the real China, but the other party is that, okay, we know that, but let's see some reality, so we can definitely be united with China. That's another party. So from the recent survey from the Taiwanese people, the economist, the one journal, asked Taiwanese people, who do you think you are? Are you Chinese or are you Taiwanese? Or if you think you are Chinese, you think be united with the main China is okay for you or not? Then there has been increasing answer that they answer, I'm Chinese and I'm okay with united with the main China. So they prefer to be the entire Chinese rather than the independent Chinese or independent Taiwanese. Because I think that's because there are so much gaps between this one and that one right now in terms of economic power, like North Korea and South Korea. If you ask North Korean who you are, then they will definitely answer, I'm Korean. And who do you think the best country, if you have to be united with some country, then who do you prefer most? Then they will answer definitely China. Most of North Koreans think they are Korean, but they don't like to be united with South Korea. They prefer to be united with China because power is here. So that's kind of sad but realistic perspective on this region. Taiwan really wants to survive by themselves, but they know the reality. They know China is number 2 country in the world, so their enemy is so strong, so bigger than them, and there is still probability to defend themselves if there is a war between them and the China. So they know the reality, so some people answer a little bit more realistically. So I think it's better to be a Chinese rather than die during the war. So they answer, okay, so I'm okay with the China. I'm okay with get along with the China. That's better than die just killed by Chinese army or something. So they saw some reality there. But some extreme party, the other party, is still arguing that we are real China and they are fake China, and we need to definitely dominate the entire territory of China. So they still insist on part of that. So it is really complicated politics. So we have some regions around the world that have really complicated history of politics. For instance, the UK and the Ireland, that's really complicated, and Israel and Palestine, they also really complicated. And South Korea and North Korea is pretty much complicated, and Taiwan and China is really, really complicated. So we have several regions that never solve kinds of problems by themselves, and there is still ongoing possibility of taking a war as a solution, kind of potential solution. Okay, good question. And now we are coming back from Samcheonpo, and we can finally turn the other pages for sure. Okay. So we have been talking huge time about the inflation. So I think we can skip some part of this page for sure. We can address some exceptional part, especially for this developing Asian region. So most of inflation happened during the pandemic or right after pandemic was mainly because of some most advanced countries like the United States or some central, European, Eurozone countries. So their inflation pressure is a little bit lower than that of the United States or the Eurozone region. But still, this Russian invasion into Ukraine exacerbated inflation pressures by disrupting supply chains. So we'll heavily talk about the next chapter. I am preparing for the new lecture note about specifically the Russian-Ukraine war and the economic impact of this war on the rest of the world by making some literature review. So the main result of Russian-Ukraine war on this Asian region is supply chain disruption. So in supply side, there is a kind of lack or a kind of bottleneck in some part of supply. So some goods prices are pretty good, go up. And also the product prices is also go up because Ukraine and Russia are pretty good important supplier of the food and energy to the most of countries in Caucasus and Central Asia. So those two regions are a little bit negatively affected by this war because of the food prices and energy prices went up by disrupting the supply chains. So the core inflation remained high because of pretty good reason. The consumer activity because of the economic reopening of China and the other countries are boosting their core inflation. As we discussed a lot, the core inflation is the part of inflation that only captures demand side of that. So core inflation, the meaning of the high core inflation means that there is higher level of demand from that domestic country, and the reason of this high demand is definitely by some more economic activity in the country. And the economic activity in this region was pretty much boosted by the reopening policy of China and the other countries. So for instance, this is pretty good number in some countries of Central Asia and some Asian countries like Kazakhstan and the Kyrgyz Republic. Their core inflation is double digits, so it's seriously high in the December of 2022. So, and about 15% in Pakistan, and in Sri Lanka, it is more than 50%. This is too high and pretty much serious problem in those two countries. So this is core inflation in the many developing Asia in terms of percentage changes from the last year. So we can see some interesting fact from this table. Caucasus and Central Asia country here, Armenia, inflation rate is 7% and December 2022 was 8.1%. In average, from 2015 to 2019, it was just 1%, just slightly over the 1%. But now they have, in 2022, 7%. So a lot of gaps between their normal inflation rate, core inflation rate, and their actual inflation rate in 2022. So Armenia experienced too high inflation in terms of core inflation rate. Georgia is the same. Their core inflation was 6.3%, but their normal inflation was less than 4%. So it is also huge gap between those two different time horizon. And Kazakhstan and Kyrgyz Republic had the most severe inflation surge, like 15% and 15.4% in 2022, but their normal inflation rate was 8% or even under 3%. So those two countries had too high inflation during the 2022. which was really, really agonizing or painful for the most of people in these two countries. But there is a little bit of different story here in these East Asian countries. How about Taiwan and Korea, South Korea? Those countries' core inflation in 2022 was like this. It's pretty lower, definitely lower than the Central Asian countries, but their core inflation in normal time was even lower than that. Less than 1% in Taiwan, less than 2% in South Korea, but they also have pretty much higher core inflation rate in 2022. These two countries are the biggest problematic countries during 2022 in terms of inflation. Their normal time core inflation rate was less than 6% or less than 5%, but their actual inflation in terms of core inflation in the 2022 was more than 11% and more than even 43%. It is too high and really bad situation for the Pakistan and the Sri Lanka. Indonesia is one exceptional country. Their core inflation in 2022 was less than 3%, and their normal time inflation rate on average was 3.5%. So this country core inflation is lower than their average time of inflation. So they had managed it really well in terms of core inflation. So Indonesia is only exceptional country that has pretty much a stable inflation condition than the other countries. And the other Southeast Asian countries also had pretty good condition relative to the rest of the Asian countries like Malaysia, 3% of core inflation, a little bit higher than their average time inflation rate. Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, they have definitely higher inflation rate, but it is not that severe or not that problematic. So we can conclude that inflation was pretty much more problematic in the poor cases and Central Asia country because of the Russian war. The export and re-export and more economic activity from this Russian war, they had experienced high inflation rate than the other region of Asia. And also some East Asian countries like Taiwan and Republic of Korea, they also had some kinds of higher core inflation rate because of supply chain disruption or the other factors. But the most problem countries were Pakistan and Sri Lanka. They had pretty much really big problem in controlling inflation. So we can easily guess that the normal average people in Sri Lanka will suffer decline of their real income cut by half. So you have to spend twice money to buy the same unit of good, like shampoo or maybe toothbrush or something. The price of shampoo would be definitely doubled up while your income at the same level. So you got poorer just cut by the half in the Sri Lanka. So it is really, really bad problem here. So how about international trade in the Asian countries? As you know, export is really important source of getting grown for many countries, including South Korea. So export performance in developing Asia has been divided by two parts in 2022. The first part is pretty good, and the second part is pretty bad. So export surge in the first half was neutralized or offset by decreasing global demand for electronics or any other durable good in the second half. So the first half export performance in Asian countries are good, but the second half is bad because of decreasing demand from the out of the rest of the world. But Southeast Asian countries are also still exceptional case because of their diverse portfolios, including commodities, electronics, and the machinery. So here is Indonesia and Malaysia as an example. they exported a lot of different goods and services, so they were not negatively shocked by one single source of negative external shock or something. They can still manage a part of their export pretty much continuously, while the other part are negatively shocked because of the decreasing in the global demand or something. So the Southeast Asian countries displayed a little bit more resilience in their export. So this is sectoral contributions to the nominal export growth in developing Asia. So as you see that in January 22, this is the beginning period of the COVID pandemic. We can see here. And this is the first page of the pandemic, which means that really severe restriction on the mobility. So we could not go to the school in this first period. But the second period here, second page of the pandemic, we can see the shift in demand from durable good to the service good because the mobility restriction has been really lifted up by many countries also. So in the first phase of the pandemic, we have some negative in the overall export performance, but they recovered pretty fast because of some part of the supply chain disruption. In the first page of this part, it was recovered by smoothing some part of their supply chain. So in the first part, electronics, the durable good, was the main contributor in export of these countries. Like this part, more than half of their export was contributed by their electronics or the semiconductor-centric durable good part. But as time goes by, this part, the commodities and the food, or the other diverse part of the mechanical machinery and vehicles, the other part became more important as the mobility restriction was lifted up and the mobility getting easier for the many countries, and they needed diverse goods and services rather than the durable good. So the contributions of electronic goods has been decreasing, while the overall volume has been increased still at the first part of 2022. But the other part, like the mechanical machinery or the vehicles or some food for the tourism part of that, they have the bigger contributions to their main export. So Southeast Asian countries have a lot of benefit from these kinds of structure in the export because they are exporting a lot of food here. They also export the basic level of the vehicle or machinery here. But the South Korea or Taiwan or the other, the top part of their supply chain, like producing semiconductor directly or producing some really high technology durable good like television or car or plant or ship, they saw the decline of their contributions in this part of it. So their main contributions to electronics has been declining in the end part of 2022. And this is just decomposed by the region country. So you can see that this South Asia is here, and Caucasus is here. So we have a lot of volatility in this Central Asian Caucasus region. So I cannot exactly see what kind of factors made a lot of improvement in their export performance also. But we can easily see that the South Asian countries, their export performance has been consistently getting better from the beginning of the pandemic to the end of the pandemic era. And the biggest contributors is the mineral or the other natural resources and some manufacturing of the food. These kinds of parts are the biggest contributors to their export performance. So we can relate these pictures to the demand shift from the durable good to the tourism or the other service industry, and we can relate each especially detailed contributors to the kinds of the bigger pictures of shift of the demand. Okay, so one more picture, one more pages that is talking about the tourism and the remittance in developing Asia. So tourism sector is going to be rebound in 2023 and 2024, driven by the multiple factors. The biggest factor for the rebound for tourism economy is definitely vaccination. If you vaccinated, then you can have definitely more confidence. Okay, so we can go abroad because I'm vaccinated. I will be okay. I will be safer than the other people. So we can definitely go abroad and we can enjoy some time because I'm going to be protected by my vaccination. So vaccination rate is one of the factors, and the travel restrictions relaxation by China and the other country are also huge factors for the tourism economy's recovery and the pent-up demand. Do you guys familiar with the pent-up dictionary? Pent-up is the newly created dictionary in the recent years because you guys were depressed or forced by government not to consume any service goods during the pandemic, but your desire is still there. So you cannot go out, but you really want to go out, but your desire is controlled by the government, so you have saved a lot of your desire inside your mind. So you are waiting until the time when the government lifted up their government restriction, and right after that, you just make all of your desire to be realized by just one time, huge shot for your consumption. So right after the mobility restriction was lifted by the South Korean government, they rushed to the travel agency website and they just make a reservation for the flight ticket. So the flight ticket prices will really go up in really few days. That's a part of the example of the pent-up demand. So, and travel is one of the main activities that were hugely restricted by the government. So, for instance, I could not go to even Jeju Island for 3 years because of that kinds of flight ticket difficulties or any kind of restriction. So my desire was go to Jeju Island with my family during the pandemic era, and I did that right after this restriction just ended up. So that's a kind of pent-up consumption for me, and my desire or my pent-up consumption is definitely dedicated to a travel or any kind of tourism, because that was the main kinds of sources of my first desire or my first desire. So these kinds of tourism recovery has been observed particularly in Caucasus and Central Asia, Pacific and South Asian countries. These countries have some attractive places to invite or to attract more foreigners, foreign tourists. I think so. I'm really enjoying some YouTube clips by some really, celebrity YouTubers. They never go to Europe. I don't know why. They usually go to Central Asian countries. Do you guys know some really famous traveling YouTubers like Bani Botel? Do you guys know Bani Botel or Kwak or something? That kinds of guys usually go to some Central Asia or Caucasus countries, and popularity of that kind of video clip is huge. But if they go to Japan or maybe Europe, there is no popularity among the viewers. I don't know why, but for me, I honestly enjoying the videos about some places I never been there, because I have some curiosity about the kind of places like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or maybe Kyrgyz Republic. I never been there, but I want to know about the country. And the YouTubers go there and they show some places. Okay, this place is really good and this place is really wide and people are pretty nice. Some people are really bad, so they just show the kinds of different culture. And I'm really enjoying that kind of YouTube video. So I think these kinds of Asian countries have more attractive places for the tourism industry. I believe so, rather than maybe South Korea or Japan. I think South Korean places are boring definitely for some tourists. Maybe Daejeon. You know, Daejeon is definitely more boring city than any cities in Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan. I believe so. Do you guys agree with that? No. No? Part of that. All right. Any question? If you don't have any question, we can stop here and we can continue for the next time.